My name is Dawn Devine and welcome to my studio. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, the birth of Bedlah. Before I begin with a slide presentation, I ordinarily do a Q&A session with the people who attend my lecture, and I ask folks how many people have had a course with me or have sat through an art history style lecture, and oftentimes people will keep their hands down. So I thought I would take a moment to prepare you for what's about to happen. So I present my material in the form of a slideshow. Generally, I stand to the side with the laser pointer and I point. However, I haven't quite figured out how to do that technologically. So what you're going to see is a video that I shot of my slides with a voiceover. And while I do my best, I am a researcher and a belly dancer and a costume maker, not necessarily the best videographer on the planet. So this lecture, The Birth of Bedlah, is going to cover approximately a 40-year span from 1880 to 1920, where we're going to really focus on the 1900 to 1915 range. Our goal is to pinpoint with some level of accuracy when the Bedlah, the three-piece belly dance uniform of bra, belt, and skirt, came into being and really got codified. There are many different types of resources that we can look at when we're trying to pinpoint this moment. We can look at photography, we can look at vintage films, we can look at artworks created by contemporary artists, and we can also look at what happened just before and just after this period, so we can trace the tree and see where things started to appear and where things diverged and took off in other areas. So over the next 40 minutes, I will be covering this material. If you have any questions about this lecture, please feel free to email me. My email address is davina@davina.us, spelled D-A-V-I-N-A @davina.us. And if you like this video, please be sure to go to YouTube, subscribe to see more videos in the future. I look forward to hearing from you. Let me know if you like it, and without further ado, let's go to the slides. So let's dive into the subject, the birth of Bedlah. But what do we mean by the birth of Bedlah? We're talking about that historical moment when clothing worn to dance in became a stage iconic uniform. There are many different kinds and styles of belly dance costume, from glamorous dresses to ethnographic garments. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing in on that three-piece bra, belt, and skirt ensemble that we call Bedlah. Now, Bedlah is the word taken directly from Arabic and means uniform. And in this slide, I'd like you to take a moment to look at these various working uniforms. A working uniform means that the general public can understand what your job is. So if you're a doctor, a fireman, or a member of the military, at a glance, somebody will be instantly able to identify what your role is in society. The same holds true for the world of entertainment. And if you look at the bottom row, you can see that we know that Bozo is a clown, that the ladies in the middle are showgirls, and that the three images of a dancer on the right are pictures of a belly dancer. Prior to the development of the Bedlah set, it would be difficult for a person to look at these images and instantly recognize them as belly dancers. We're quite familiar at this point with the history of modern belly dance as we know it, and we understand that these are dancers. But a 19th century audience wasn't as savvy as we are. During the second half of the 19th century, most people wouldn't have the opportunity to see a belly dancer unless they were visiting one of the countries of origin like Turkey, Egypt, Morocco, and so on. But throughout those 25 to 50 years, as we closed in on the year 1900, people traveled more, and as they traveled, they brought back postcards to share with their friends and family. In these images, dancers were identified by either accompanying musicians, as in the top left, or with their arms held high in a dance position, like the center image. By the 1890s, postcard companies were just simply putting Arab dancing girl or danseuse or dance du venture on the bottoms of their postcards so that the dancers could strike any pose they like but still be identifiable. On the right and on the bottom left, the Gwazi dancers strike non-dancer poses but wear their iconic costumes. In this day of the internet and the proliferation of imagery, we understand that these two images represent Gwazi dancers from Egypt. As you compare these two images, the one on the right and bottom left, you might think that they were taken in the same country. However, they were not. The image on the right comes from Egypt, but the image on the left was taken in Chicago. Ethnographic exhibits had long been a staple of the World's Fair or International Exhibition, and it was no different at the Great Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893. This was the stage that Little Egypt danced on at the World's Fair. And while many researchers dispute who the actual, quote, Little Egypt, unquote, was, it turns out that that was a stage role, no different than playing Salome or Aida, two other great Orientalist subjects. In the 1890s, you can see that a belly dancer's costume was basically a long chemise, a Turkish-style vest, a skirt, and for the Gwazi dancers, they would wear a hip wrap with long tabs that would fly when they spun. Although we have no idea what any of these Little Egypt dancers look like on stage in performance, we are lucky enough to have a few surviving videos from the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries. In this clip, we see the Turkish dancer Princess Raja performing a chair dance and playing finger cymbals at the same time. Although a chair may not be the most popular prop currently, at the turn of the century, it was something that many circus performers did. And so acts like this perfectly blended dancing and acrobatics to create a stunning sensation. Note how she is doing floor work, going down to the ground to demonstrate her flexibility and balance and the control she has over what looks to be a heavy chair. She finishes up with a grand flourish and never once loses her grip. Or is that her bite? However, it's important to keep in mind that Little Egypt was not the only dancer at the Chicago World's Fair performing Middle Eastern dance. On the left, we have one of the numerous Little Egypts who performed in the Egyptian Streets of Cairo exhibit. On the top center, we have a performer from the Turkish tea room with her arms raised and her finger cymbals on. And on the bottom, we have an image identified as a Jewish sword dancer. So how did we go from this multiplicity of ethnographic costumes worn to perform Middle Eastern dance that specified a particular region and culture, to a more generic uniform that simply identified the dancer as in her professional role? Before we look at the future of dance costume, let's take a moment to get a grip on what was happening in Western culture in the late 19th century. With the speeding up of travel and more people visiting the Middle East, there was an obsession with Middle Eastern themes and subjects in art, theater, literature, and music. Today we call this Orientalism, but back in the 19th century, that term did not exist. And we're looking at a faddish, popular culture embracing of these elements of Middle Eastern design and culture. One place we saw a big change with this new fad was in theatrical costumes. I'm going to take the example of the iconic character Cleopatra. On our left, we have British actress Lily Langtry in 1890 portraying Cleopatra in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. When you compare that to her competitor and rival Sarah Bernhardt, the French actress, on the top right, we can see that much attention is being drawn to her hip region. In the center bottom, we have Constance Collier from 1906, and you can see that she isn't wearing a corset and has much more freedom in the shape and contours of her body. This is well before the corset had been abandoned by fashionable women, but echoes the costuming that was worn by dancers portraying other characters from this period. By this year, dancers were wearing much more free and revealing costumes, and you can see this echoed in Constance's loose garments. Just for some greater context, I've included this image bottom right of Theda Bara from the now lost 1917 movie Cleopatra. By 1918, the belly dance costume as we know it and understand it, its three-piece bra, belt, and skirt set, had already been formulated. So the average person going to the movies and watching Cleopatra would understand that this is a dance costume. Very few costumes have survived since the 1890s. And I thought I would take a moment to take a little detour and discuss how surfaces were made to shine in the late 19th century. In 1889, Ellen Terry wore this beautiful green crocheted dress for her role as Lady Macbeth in the Shakespearean play Macbeth. Before the introduction of gas lighting and later electric lighting, theaters were lit by gas lamps, oil lamps, and sometimes even candles. To get the maximum amount of shine and shimmer on stage, beetle wings, metal discs, metal sequins, and rhinestones were used extensively and heavily to embellish garments. This dress was coated with thousands of beetle wings that were worked into a crocheted pattern over dress, and the dress has miraculously survived. You can find it at Small Hythe in Kent. Just as an aside, the painting on the left is by John Singer Sargent and depicts Ellen Terry in this dress in a pivotal moment in the Macbeth story. Another example of an Orientalist themed character is Aida from the Vivaldi opera. Aida opened in 1871 in Cairo at the Khedive Opera House and has been performed thousands of times since its opening. When we compare two costumes from the 1890s, the one at left worn by Philia Litvine and the bottom middle by Emma Eames, we see that typical 1890s silhouette, or alternately a stylized Roman style costume. But only a few years later, in the first decade of the 20th century, we can see that Aida is now being dressed in a costume that more closely resembles a belly dancer. In addition to the title role of Aida, there was a second female character, Amneris, here played by Mademoiselle Soyer. Or this headshot of Amneris played by Bruna Castagna. But perhaps the most important character in our timeline is Salome. Because Salome comes directly from the Christian religious experience, she is widely depicted throughout the centuries. In this slide, we can see a few examples of how her image has changed. In the 16th century, in both Italy and Northern Europe, painters like Titian and Cranach would depict her in contemporary and regional clothing, along with her icons of a charger and John the Baptist's head. By the second half of the 19th century, the head had disappeared, and her costume is taking on a more fantasy, quasi-historical look. The first decade of the 20th century, she has now firmly established herself as a belly dancer, wearing a costume that has all of the hallmarks of the future Bedlah style. Without a doubt, it was the character Salome and her portrayal on stages all over the world that changed and impacted the way belly dancers look today. The scandalous English playwright and novelist Oscar Wilde wrote the play Salome in 1891 specifically for actress Sarah Bernhardt. When Sarah Bernhardt took the stage in the early 1890s, she wore a variation on the quasi-fantasy, quasi-historical style costuming that was used to portray Orientalist female figures. Her standardized style becomes especially clear when you see her later role of Grismonda from 1889 on the right. Both of these costumes feature an embellished chest region and accents around the hip. These are elements that will become codified in the belly dance uniform. Inspired by Oscar Wilde's play, Richard Strauss created the opera Salome, which was released in 1905. The lithe and lovely opera singer Aino Akti took on the role of Salome and chose to wear a belly dance style costume. Unlike this promotional photograph, which a patron could buy in the lobby of the theater, the playbills and posters produced showed Akti in a more traditional opera-style costume. It's important to note that these operas featured two kinds of performers playing the role of Salome. On the left, we have opera singer Louise Monte wearing a beautifully styled, if classically fit, corseted dress. On the right, we have an unknown Salome. Notice her unfettered torso, allowing her to move freely. Notice also that her skirt is transparent and her legs are visible, allowing her a free range of motion, but also, even when standing still, a peek at forbidden fruits. It can often be quite confusing to see a tightly corseted figure like Louise on the left labeled Salome when we know that at this time period Salome dancers were wearing costumes more like the one on the right. If you set aside the issue of the corset, you'll notice that there are many stylistic features in common between these two Salomes. Although the singer might be wearing something a little more confining, she still has the emblematic circular motifs over her bust that would indicate her role as Salome. In both of these costumes, emphasis has been placed on the hip region with a long Egyptian-style panel down the front. This was typical of many Salome costumes during this time. So while Oscar Wilde gave Salome her veils, it was Strauss's opera that made her dance, and over the next 15 years, there was a flood of Salomes. This slide doesn't even begin to give you a hint at how many Salomes there were dancing across stages worldwide. On the top left is former ballerina Ida Rubinstein. On the right is an unknown Japanese Salome, complete with a bucket and the head of John the Baptist. Across the bottom row, we have the French Mademoiselle de Wailly from 1908. We have an undated Italian dancer named Voicelou Quintas. Continuing on the right, we have Lotta Faust, who was British, and La Sylph, who is French. The most surprising part about this Salomania was how long it lasted. For nearly 2 decades, Salomes were seen on variety stages all over the world, and their costumes, while they varied quite a bit, seemed to have the same set of features. The round motif over the bust, the heavy embellishment around the hip, and a sheer or transparent skirt. To make things even more interesting, a second opera version of Salome, based on Oscar Wilde's play, was released in France in 1908 by Mariotte. Mariotte, unless an image is correctly identified with the name of the opera and its composer, we don't know which opera these various Salomés are from. If a researcher is lucky, an image will come with all of the information attached, including the name of the dancer, the date of the performance, and who wrote the libretto for the opera. But of all the dancers who portrayed Salome, Maud Allan of Canada is perhaps the best known. She opened in 1906 in Vienna and performed as Salome through the early 1920s. The reason why she is the best known is because she had such a long career playing the same character. In her one-woman show, she primarily wore neoclassical garments like this stylized Greek chiton on the right. However, it was her one dance, The Vision of Salome, that had the most documentation. The costume was considered scandalous, and it created quite the sensation when it appeared on stage, even though it was only a small part of her repertoire. Back in the first decade of the 20th century, performing artists made money via merch, the same way that artists do today. And postcards like these were popular purchases for theater-going audiences. We are lucky to have hundreds of different poses and images of Maud, including beautiful front, back, side, and action shots. In this pair of images, you can see that she is wearing a transparent skirt that is embellished with rhinestones and sequins. However, unlike other dancers who we only have images for, one of Maud's costumes has actually survived. Her costume was composed of 3 pieces. She had this fantastic headdress, a crusty bust cover, and a skirt with a very ornate belt. All 3 of these costume pieces were lavishly embellished with both fresh and faux pearls, rhinestones, and metal sequins. Take a moment to really look at the slide and see how this costume was designed to catch and reflect every bit of light that shone onto the stage. The sheer transparent skirt would give this a scandalous air. In this costume, you can already see all of the elements that make up a contemporary Bedlah set. Maud also wrote an autobiography called My Life in Dancing, which features her thoughts on this costume and descriptions of how it appeared in editorial and critical newspaper articles of the time. This costume is in the collection of the Dance Collection Dance Museum in Toronto, Canada, and it is often on display. If you are going to be in the Toronto area, you should go and check it out. Even if it's not on display, you can ask to see it if you do it with a smile. Of course, Salome was not the only Orientalist dance in town. Early modern dancer Ruth St. Denis was also new to the dance scene and gave her first performance in 1906. She had a love of the Orient from the edge of the Mediterranean all the way to the Far East, including India. These 2 gorgeous postcards are from her first piece, Radha, which debuted in 1906. Ruth was directly inspired by Indian culture and, in particular, the Hindu of Rajasthani, and she pulled a lot of their design elements and put them into this costume. But rather than wear an authentic costume from India, Ruth chose to wear a stylized, embellished performance costume that was eye-catching and distinctive. In this detail shot on the left, you can see that she was very heavily influenced by the Salome dance costumes that were flooding the theatrical world. Notice the round circular motifs over her bust and the very thick, ornate embellishment over the chest. And while you might think, well, These round motifs on the bust often appear in India. I would like you to think back to Sandra Bernhardt and the depictions of Aida and Cleopatra from the 19th century as having an influence in this costume of Ruth St. Denis. While it is unknown who came up with this design motif, it had already been circulating amongst Orientalist costumes for the past 30 years. In contrast, look at this beautiful costume on the right with its very ornate headdress and body jewelry worn over a form-fitting dress. This costume is more in line with what was happening in the world of experimental ballet. It's this amazing headdress I'd like you to look at and keep in your mind while we move to the next slide. Although this is from a later period, we do have a surviving Ruth St. Denis headdress available for us to look at. This costume piece dates to her 1919 performance of Kuan Yin and is located in the Ruth St. Denis collection at Jacob's Pillow. Although this crown was made nearly 8 years after Maud Allen's Salome ensemble, you can see many of the design features and elements are the same. Along with pearls, metal sequin, and rhinestones, Ruth has also chosen to integrate recycled jewelry components with enamel and mirrors. Ruth St. Denis went on to form an influential dance studio that trained an entire generation of modern dancers. A few clips of Ruth St. Denis performing her ethnographic pieces have survived. This performance of the Nautch dance probably bears a striking resemblance to her earlier pieces such as Radha of 1906. By 1931, when this piece was filmed, you could see that Ruth has really gone back to her roots, exploring actual, authentic Indian style and less Orientalism, flash and flare. You can find this piece along with its original music on YouTube, and I recommend you go and check it out. Well, Ruth St. Denis and Maud Allen had the benefit of being able to tour as a one-woman show. The majority of Orientalist-style dancers were appearing in variety theater, dinner theaters, cabarets, and other forms of group shows, like vaudeville and burlesque in the United States. In the first decade of the 20th century, perhaps the two most notable cabaret-style shows were the Moulin Rouge and the Folies Bergère in Paris, France. Often in these group shows, a dancer would take on many different roles, and an Orientalist-themed dance might appear in amongst reviews, chorus lines, can-can dances. The Oriental number was considered a specialty act, along with things like flamenco or hula. Consequently, dancers needed to be versatile, and so did their costuming. In this slide, we have 5 images of the same dancer. Her name was Hero, and she danced in the Paris area in and around 1910. As you can see from the image on the right, her skirt was removable, so she could appear dressed like a showgirl in a scanty costume, or she could put on her skirt and grab her veil and become Salome. During the course of my research, Hero is the oldest convertible costume where the belt and the skirt are separate pieces. And though she appears nude, she is actually wearing a sleeveless body stocking called pinks. Another very versatile and popular dancer who was touring Europe in 1910 was Sahari Gili. You can see by this trio of costumes that the belly dance style was in place at this time. The veil, the sandals, the bra, the belt, and the skirt have all come together to create a very modern and contemporary looking belly dance costume. I'd like to point out a few of the details that are reoccurring in belly dance costuming in this second decade of the 20th century. We see a transparent skirt with a heavily embellished border or hem. The simple bust covering is giving way to a more structured bra that not just covers the bust but supports and cups the shape of the breast. And I'd like to take a moment to point out her beautiful shoes. You know that those shoes could be worn on any stage right now. And while it's hard at times to determine whether a picture is an actual dancer or somebody who's just wearing a costume and modeling, in the case of Sahara Jili, we know that she was a performer, in part because of the rave reviews for her acrobatic and tumbling. She was also a contortionist, and here you can see her blending her amazing flexibility with her dance style. I'd like to point out that the costume on the right has that classic bra, belt, skirt set with the heavily embellished base, this time with a ribbon or trim added. Without a doubt, the costume on the right is definitely a belly dance costume. Costume on the left, however, was one she would perform her contortionist and acrobatic work. It had split legs that ended in a gathered harem pant style at the bottom. While it still has Orientalist styling and theming, definitely has a slightly different purpose. Of course, today, wearing harem pants to dance in is perfectly acceptable. Moving forward in time, we see bigger and grander tableaus set up. Here we have the 1919 Ziegfeld Follies Salome. If you look carefully, you can see Salome in the center, in the back, holding up the head of John the Baptist. As you look at this, you can see all of these scantily clad nude women in the front. Ziegfeld was intentionally copying the French style as exemplified by the Folies Bergère. And so his tableaus were filled with nude women who would lounge around doing nothing. His dancing girls, however, all wore costumes. And as you can see, the Salome somewhere in between with a scandalously cut bra and what looks like a bikini. It's important to note that when Ziegfeld was staging a show, all of the costumes were designed to go together, so everybody would be in as high a style, and the Oriental dancers included in Ziegfeld's show wore costumes that were as covered in rhinestones and sequin as their showgirl counterparts, so everybody could be equally glamorous and stunning. Unfortunately, we do not have any more detailed images from this show, so we don't actually know what Salome wore when she did her infamous Dance of the Seven Veils. However, we do have images of Ziegfeld girl Marion Benda in an Oriental style costume. Marion was infamously a femme fatale and went to Hollywood after her stint with Ziegfeld to make movies. She is closely associated with Rudolph Valentino, and her image is well documented in movie magazines. However, before she became a star, she was a showgirl with Ziegfeld Follies. When we compare Marion on the left in her Orientalist image against a more typical Ziegfeld girl showing much more skin with elaborate headdress and jewelry and cape. When we compare this Oriental dance ensemble with this showgirl ensemble, we definitely see that these two types of showgirls are diverging, moving in separate directions into separate futures. So while showgirls and Oriental dancers were sisters, into the 1930s, belly dance costumes and showgirl costumes continued to split, diverging in style and context as popular entertainment changed and shifted. Advances in technology changed the way popular culture consumed entertainment. Musicals appeared when sound was first added to film and then later television, killing off the local variety theaters. Vaudeville evolved into what we think of as Broadway big theater, whereas burlesque split into components. Comedians and singers migrated to the world of television, leaving behind the striptease artists who were not considered appropriate for television. The art of striptease had to stand on its own, and to draw a crowd showed more and more skin, evolving into the stripper of today. Another place you could see dancers in the Orientalist style was at the circus. Here's a clip from the 1920s of a belly dancer on a midway. It is interesting to see one dancer in a more ethnographic style top while the other is wearing a Bedlah style bra. Of course, we cannot talk about the birth of Bedlah without taking a moment to think about the evolution of the bra, because belly dance bras have followed the development of bras in general. Turning back for a moment to the first decade of the 20th century, we can see these images on the top reflecting what was happening in bra technology. The term brassiere first appears in conjunction with corset covers that were designed to hold the bust in place above a shortened corset. These vest-like garments would sometimes have boning to help keep the bust line in place and from moving. By the 19-teens, bandeau-style bras were being widely manufactured. On the bottom left is an ad for an early-style bandeau bra for sale, and on our right is the infamous Mata Hari wearing a bandeau-style top as part of her costume. Carice Crosby, top left, and her invention was one of the first bras to be patented. Although the triangular-shaped bra was first patented in the teens, it wasn't until the late 20s when it became a popular design. Until then, bandeaus continued to reign supreme. On the top left, we have two typical bras of the 1920s. On the bottom left, we have dancer Olive Elkhorn wearing the new triangular style. And on our right are two unknown showgirls from the Folies Bergère. So by the 1930s, the brassiere, or bra, was firmly in place. We see examples like the top left, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We see it in surviving ads and in images from stage and screen. On our left is an unknown Salome dancer. In the center, we have a showgirl. Believe it or not, that's Ginger Rogers. And on our right, we have the amazing Claudette Colbert as Cleopatra. Although slightly outside of the scope of this talk, I wanted to just wrap up with this image from the 1940s. On the top left are two bras in the collection of the Met. On the right is an ad for the Wonder Bra, and on our lower left is an image from Egypt, that's Tahia Carioca and Farid El-Atresh. As you can see, by the 1940s, the bra form was very well established, and moving forward in time, it was changes in style, taste, and technology that altered the shape and style of bras. So as we review the information that I've covered, we've traced the development of the Bedlah from ethnographic costumes in the 1890s through the craze of Salomania and the obsession with Salome as a character. We talked about the costuming of the early Orientalist dancers of the first and second decades of the 20th century. We looked at early modern dancer Ruth St. Denis, the quintessential Salome Maud Allen, and a few other dancers joined in the party, including scandalous spy Mata Hari. We discussed how changes in technology also impacted how belly dance costumes look. We also had the opportunity to look at a few surviving costumes from the period, including Ellen Terry's dress, Maud Allen's Bedlah set, and a headdress worn by Ruth St. Denis in one of her later performances. All in all, the development of the Bedlah took place in a 20-year span from 1900 to 1920. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this journey from the 1880s to the 1920s as we explored the development of the birth of Bedlah. Please be sure to check your email box. I will have sent a handout with a timeline and a selected readings that go with this. I hope that you have fun exploring the rest of the items in the Bellydance Bundle 2018. Bye-bye. So that's the end of my lecture. If you have any questions, again, you can email me at davina@davina.us, and I'll be happy to answer them. If you would like to have more information about costume history, drop me a line and I'll see if there's something I can help you with when you're doing your research. My favorite fabric is a suit. You know, I've written that book, The Cloth of Egypt, All About a Suit, which is available on Amazon.com. And if you really want to know what I'm working on, you can visit and join my Facebook group, Studio Davina Behind the Seams, where there's a lively conversation amongst makers and fellow costume researchers. I hope that you enjoy all the various parts and pieces of the Bellydance Bundle as much as I am enjoying working my way through them. I hope you have a great day and happy dancing. Bye.